Science at New Mexico State University. Grew up on a cattle ranch in southern Colorado and got his MS and BS degrees in animal science at Colorado State University. And then before coming to New Mexico State University, Derek worked at Montana State University and USDA ARS. And so today, we're fortunate to have him with us here, and he's going to share a little bit about the potential to use genetic selection to manipulate terrain use of beef cattle. And so with that, I'm going to ask that Dr. Bailey share his screen, and I'll get out of the way and let him present that. And then if you do have questions, you can post them in the chat, and we'll keep up with that and take those kind of toward the end of Dr. Bailey's presentation. So Dr. Bailey, it's all yours.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Ben, thanks, Scott, and thanks, Jim Sprinkle, who invited me. I really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all today. And I'm going to try to talk to you about a project that has really been a team effort. We have a lot of people we've worked with, we've worked with a lot with Colorado State, Montana, folks in Montana State used to work with, University of Nevada, Reno, Chico State, UC Davis.
Hey, Dr. Bailey.
And we really appreciate it.
I'm having just a little bit of trouble hearing you. I don't know if you can maybe get a little closer to the mic or.
I'll try. Let's see if I can get that work a little better. How about that? Does that sound better?
It's a little bit better.
It's about as close as I can probably get.
Okay.
I'm hoping that works. Let's try that. Is that any better?
That's a little bit better, yes.
Oops. Okay, so first thing is that grazing distribution is really an important thing. If it was like, if grazing was like this, where you could just get an even amount all across the landscape, I wouldn't be talking to you today. It'd be easy, management would be easy, but this is really not reality at all. The problem is that we have poor distribution. A lot of times, like you see at this picture of the University of Nevada, Reno's gun ranch, cattle don't always use steep slopes, high elevations, and areas far from water. They go all over the place. I mean, they tend to stay near water, especially things in riparian areas, and that causes problems and lots of issues. And one of the things is what can we do about it? We know a lot of things. Like we can develop new waters, we can build fences, we can put supplement out, and we can herd. And what we're going to talk about today mostly is genetic selection. We first kind of visit about a little bit about the whys and hows. So one thing is riparian areas here, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with riparian areas. They can, if they're not, livestock management isn't managed well, bad things can happen. And if you manage them well, good things can happen as well. And these systems can recover. So to do that, because of that, BLM and Forest Service often have standards, like stubble height standards, like probably a lot of you are aware of. You tend to have to move your cattle to a different pasture off the allotment once for the stubble heights near the streams. The riparian areas drops to 4 or 5 inches. And if the stubble height isn't met very consistent or season use or maybe stocking rates, which may cause some trouble with the operation. So this distribution is a big deal. There's economics in it too. It's not just riparian areas. We did a little study with John and other folks at University of Idaho. Changing the distribution can be profitable in a lot of cases. One example we did is that using supplement to extend the grazing season increased the profit of a simulated ranch by over 4,000. But this may be an easier example on the bottom. NMSU has Corona Ranch in central New Mexico, got a large pay that on average was 2,300 meters or 1.4 miles from water versus cow 9008 that was only a mile from water on average. We tracked it for GPS units for 2 months in the summer. It's an average difference of about 651 meters or 0.4 miles. That's a difference of about 514 acres of potential use area. So if you get animals to travel for, you get more land and you get even up your utilization and get more grass to things. So it's worth something. It can make a huge difference if you get your animals to travel further from water, use steeper slopes, and use higher elevations. And water developments are certainly a real tool. This is an example of a rancher we worked with in Wilcox, Arizona, Tom Todd. He had water everywhere, and he got some money from NRCS and even put this pipeline up to the top of this hill. You know, we had to do the digging and everything. He really went all after it. He put water everywhere, just about. If you look at this map, all the blue dots here you see on that are like these blue points are all water sources, and some up really high. The one that just last picture of that was right here. So he got it all, but he still had distribution problems. Even putting in all those points, and although he really worked at it, it didn't solve all his problems. Fencing clearly is a powerful tool. You can see here, you know, that free range beef, they're always animals trying to get out and trying to escape. So definitely, but definite tool, very powerful tool to manipulate grazing distribution. But it isn't always so easy. Fencing isn't always a great thing. If you happen to have a graze a BLM or Forest Service allotment and have wild horses, you are not going to be building any fences. And
Hey, Dr.
also,
Bailey.
yes.
So your connection's kind of fading in and out. I was wondering, is it possible maybe to shut your video off and keep your slides going? Maybe to improve the connection?
Will do. Just stopped it. Let's try
you.
that. So the fencing can be a problem with wildlife. And for example, Stevens found that there was a lot of sage grouse strikes on unmarked fences, even on marked fences, and that can be a grouse and big game. Fencing isn't always a great thing. So I'm always been interested in looking at some other ways. One has been a supplement, and here's a supplement study that we did in the Italian Alps with some Italian colleagues, and here we put a mineral block up on a steel post, and the cows were attracted to it, and they used some either steeper land, and we had to use a steel post to put this mineral block on, otherwise it rolled down to the bottom of the canyon. But it tends to work because even though cattle tend to have areas like far from water, you can see in the top of the lake, like supplement, they'll go a long ways to travel and get there. And once they get there, they'll go ahead and graze nearby areas because you've solved the problem. So if you get something that they can get them to do, like and something when to travel to, they want to go there and graze. Back before COVID, when we had the bars, our graduate students used to spend time in a bar several miles from campus. Always wondered why they went there, but because I'd go there, I saw them eating old tacos and really terrible chips, and salsa wasn't any good. I couldn't figure out why they would go there and eat that junk. And I noticed they were going for a supplement too, but it's more of a liquid barley supplement. But once they got there, they didn't mind eating whatever was made available. Same thing with cows. If you can just get them to an area, then they'll graze that grass. Here's an example. We did that. Initially, we put some on the left side of the screen. The cows, we put some, the white dots is salt, black dots are low moisture block. Cattle moved up and used an area. Once we removed it and just left the salt, there was much less use. We did it, we put another chance, we put the, track the cows without the supplement and check the change. And it just shows you, although it's not perfect, it's not like building a fence, you can really attract animals with supplement. Experience could be a big thing, but it's always have a question, don't we, between nature and nurture. And here at the University of Florida, there's doing a lot of nature and nurture, as you can see here. But we did a study where we, when I first got to New Mexico State, there was a real dry period in between 2002 and 2004, and we moved some cattle from the university's college ranch, also known as the CDRC, and we moved them to East Texas. And at another Brangus ranch, we moved our Brangus cows there. And 3 years later, we brought them back, and we called those tourist cows. They went on vacation to East Texas. And then we had some other cows. We traded some cows and brought some cows that were born and raised in East Texas and moved them back to the desert in Las Cruces in southern New Mexico. Now, this was a big change because the place we moved them was Leona, Texas. Small pastures, they graze Bermuda grass. In Las Cruces, we get 9 inches of annual precipitation. It's hot and dry, and we have big pastures, usually several thousand acres. Although we both had Brangus cattle, they had really different experiences. And the breeding of these cattle were very similar. That's one of the reasons we took our cattle to this ranch in Leona, Texas. And we did a test, we took advantage of that. So we had cattle that were naive from East Texas. We had some cows that we left at the college ranch in southern New Mexico. Those are the natives. And we had our tourists that had left and then came back. And this just shows you a visual of some of those cattle. We checked, they grazed separate pastures, but we rotated among the pastures, rotated them every 2 weeks so that the cattle would be able to check them in every pasture, wouldn't be just on pasture effects. And on average, the cows that were born in the desert and stayed in the desert traveled much further than either the naive or the tourist cows. I checked it again several times again in late summer after a really good year of lots of rain. Still, the native cows spent more time out, and you can see that the red cattle spent further and further from water several times out. And often the native cows born and raised there may not even go back to water for every 2 or 3 days. Summertime in New Mexico. The kind of take-home message that probably all know and think is that you really should try to select your placements from animals raised in pastures that they're going to graze at on your place. Like this is an example of one cow of an adapted cow. She's a 12-year-old cow, raised over a 500-pound calf, and was pregnant every year, including this time, even really with poor body conditions. She's adapted and she continues to produce. So one of the things is I'm really interested in adapted animals. And when I grew up in Colorado, some of our cows would really climb, others didn't. And we've always called them, these animals, adapted animals for mountainous terrain, hill climbers, if you see here. And there's some less adapted animals that are probably bottom dwellers. And I'm always been interested in what would happen if we were able to select for them and just keep those cows that really climbed. Because there's just a lot. We did some tracking study at the Humboldt Ranch, northeast of Winnemucca, Nevada, and near Midas. This is a 7,000 acre allotment. They had 2,000 cows. This is just 3 things, but look at the difference in the colors. Each color is a different cow. The cow with the green dots, pretty much a bottom dweller, while the blue animal and the pink animal used a lot steeper terrain. So can we take advantage of that? Can we take advantage of this variation? Here you see 2 different cows we tracked at the same time in Montana when I was up there. Same time, same place. And they were with other cows, but the cow on the left side really used some steep terrain, while this one stayed on more gentle terrain near water. And we take advantage of that. And when we separate them, we still there. So we did a study, over a 3-year study at 2 different ranches, and we watched and we separated on based on their previous grazing patterns. The ones that we saw before at hill climbers, we kept together. The ones in the bottom, we kept together. And we watched them for 3 years and then split them apart and watched them for another 3 years. And those patterns persisted. And we were hypothesizing that the hill climbers would use the slow uniformly, use all these terrain, and while the bottom dwellers, when separated, would tend to hang out. Because some had thought that hill climbers were hill climbers because the bottom dwellers are pushed socially up the hills. The bottom dwellers are more aggressive and keep the hill climbers from grazing the bottom. So we separated, and we still saw those patterns persisted. And most dwellers in the riparian areas, they had an average at the end of the grazing season of about 3 inches, and hill climbers had about 5 inches. And as I mentioned earlier, not only is that statistically significant, it's important. It meets the standard of BLM and Forest Service. One doesn't. One's 5 inches meets the standard, one doesn't. So that's an important thing. So we think there's a really big thing. Another thing that would be important, if we're going to do this, if we're even thinking about it, we got to really worry about if we select for terrain use, are we going to adversely affect performance? On 2 different studies we did in Montana, we didn't find any difference, and we didn't find any relationship between here in New Mexico between where cattle graze and any measures of of linear measures like hip height, body size, body weight, or any of those things. So it doesn't look there's any phenotypic relationship between terrain use and their performance, or any metric of like hip height per cow size. Now, this trait, though, is not an easy thing. Most of the traits that you think about are relatively easy to measure. If we select for weaning weight, yearling weight, average daily gain, it's just a matter of weighing the cattle. Birth weight's a trick, but still, you just have to go take the calf, weigh it, write the number down, enter it in the system, voila, you're done. Weaning weight's easy, you just need to weigh the calf or weaning. But there's some other traits that are trickier to do, like individual feed intake and residual feed intake, trickier to do, but terrain use may be even harder to do. First of all, it's really tricky to do. In the past, we had to buy like $4,000 GPS collars that you see here. Cost about $4 grand. They're getting a lot cheaper now, but man, they're hard to do. And so for one of my postdocs or colleagues, Colt Knight, he developed a system that was much less expensive. Instead of like the current price, previous price of low-tech collars about $1,800. Some now between $1,000 and $2,000. He can make kits for less than $250. So that's just by using simple electronics and things like that. And other folks at University of Idaho have made even cheaper ones. Jason Carl and I think Jim Sprinkle worked together and got a cheaper one as well. But these things will work, collect good data, they're reliable, and they can work. And so that makes this much encouraging, except for one thing. They generate tons of data. Like here's an example of 15 cows tracked in a pasture for 4.5 months. Positions were recorded every 10 minutes. That gives you potentially about 104 positions today, or about 19,000 locations per cow. Now, you know a lot about that cow. But it is still very difficult to process. That use is multidimensional. Steep slopes at high elevations are a bigger problem than when they're close to water. They're a long ways. And so a steep slope close to water is no big deal, but a steep slope at higher elevations or a long way from water. So it isn't really so simple. It isn't something so simple. So here's an example that I want you to do is look at this situation. This is at the Gun Ranch in central Nevada. You have 2 cows, one in brown dots, one in green dots. On average, the cow 858 was 2,093 meters in elevation. You can see she definitely had some higher points, but and her slope use wasn't bad on average. 20% slope, not too far from water because there's some small waters today. And she traveled a little further than the cow in green, who used slightly lower elevations but steeper slopes and traveled a little further from water. So which cow is the best? I don't think it's that easy to tell. And that's one of the things we work on. So what can we do? One of the things is although since it's difficult to work with all that GPS data, one of the ideas is for us to estimate the genotype or the breeding value directly from DNA. But all you might need is blood, or even now, all you need is a notch out of the ear. And genetics test might not be too expensive, maybe something less than $30. That's what we're hoping to do. So we can test the genotype directly rather than measuring it like measuring the phenotype and then inferring the genotype from pedigree. That's what we do with like weaning weight, yearling weight, things like that. We measure the phenotype, and then through pedigrees and other genetic information, we estimate the genotype. But if we can get DNA, maybe we get bulls and their ability to sire daughters that like to climb and travel. But that is required on one thing: is grazing distribution really an inherited trait? And it's like, you may be right, Martha, too domesticated here. So we did a study. Initially, we did first study of 5 ranches in Montana, New Mexico, and Arizona. And we looked at DNA directly, looked at single nucleotide polymorphisms, genetic markers. We used high chips. We looked at like 770,000 locations on the genome of each cow. And we then looked at the association of these genetic markers with some terrain use metrics. One of the things we found is that we found a few that, this is a Manhattan plot. This is the idea of looking at this. The higher the value, closer to 6, the more unusual the value is. And on chromosome 5, we have a gene called GMR5. It was very unusual. It was associated with spatial memory, location, and motivation. At high thing, we were really excited. So and in total, 6 candidate genes account for like 34% of the whole entire phenotypic variation. And that was really good news. So we decided then we would take a look at it in a second study. We added more things, more ranches to it, including those in Nevada, more in Arizona, southern Colorado, southern Wyoming, and we used a more rigorous statistical technique that wasn't available in the first study, Bayesian associations. And these ranches were very diverse and instead of using, like I said, instead of using simple linear regression to test individual SNP, we did a simultaneous thing using Bayesian. And so it was not as easy to detect associations. It was a more rigorous test. Using Bayes' theorem, which I won't bore you with, but one of the things is we still were able to find some associations with some genetic markers, some single nucleotide polymorphism SNPs. For the vertical climb, the cattle climb, we found 3. Distance to water, we found 1. In total, we found a total of 32 quantitative trait loci. That means like 32 spots that on the chromosome that were associated with terrain use. And of these, these were 29 candidate genes. So they were on, of these 32 of these chromosomes, they associated with 29 different potential genes. A lot of these were associated with health and performance, including things like hypoxia, feed efficiency, heat stress, and energy metabolism. And that is a really cool thing. So our results are similar to a study that Jim Sprinkle's doing in Idaho, where he's found associations with residual feed intake and terrain use in cattle, especially when it's during hot weather in the summer. Our data said that these terrain use, the genes that appear to be associated with terrain use are maybe some of the same things that are thing associated with feed efficiency, which ties into Jim's research, which is very encouraging. So bringing it together, these two studies is that, at least initially, is that there's a real potential to implement genetic selection. Beef cattle terrain uses are like other traits in cattle, like growth, that are polygenic. That means there's more than one gene. And one thing that's always the case, right, with professors and researchers and everything is job security, right? And so, of course, I'm going to say additional studies are needed to further elucidate genetic mechanisms under terrain use. But in this case, it's really true. It's not just job security. We just don't quite know enough. We're probably one of the, there are just not many people, and we're at it, they've been tracking enough cattle, enough interest in this to try to do this idea of genetic selection for terrain use. So where do we go from here? We had really hoped to have a genomic breeding value. So the idea that we could get some blood, send it in, do a DNA test of bulls, and then tell you which bull was more likely to sire daughters that would climb and travel from water. But unfortunately, we just couldn't do it. We just didn't have enough evidence yet and enough things to develop that genomic breeding value right now. We're just not quite there. So what are we doing? Collected some more data we haven't analyzed yet. We're going to analyze that. Is the GPS tracking is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. I was really encouraged that we might have a GPS tracking ear tag that would cost us about $40. I spent some $40 on GPS tracking ear tags, but they didn't work. So, but there are a lot of encouragement that there's a lot cheaper. The other thing we want to do is kind of study the impacts of these candidate genes on some things like heat stress. Do cattle that climb tend to do better in hot weather? Do they do well with hypoxia, even though we found a study that there was any relationship between terrain use and pulmonary arterial pressure? Look at feed efficiency, like Jim Sprinkle and his colleagues are doing energy metabolism. So that's one of the things we're going to keep plugging away on. But the one thing is that terrain use is really complex, but there's some real differences among cattle. There's some real potential there. Just look at this is this one with the Todd Ranch, the one we had where the water didn't thing. Look at the difference between these two cows. We're the same time, January through April, and one cow definitely a hill climber, one is definitely not. In a large 25 section single pass. There's a lot of potential. Example too, another thing is that, and I use this same picture here in the lower left as my background, because at the Mobley Ranch, right here near Las Cruces and Hatch, look at the terrain that one of these cows used. Those of you familiar with USGS maps, this used some terrain. They really climbed. Yet there's still grass around, but some cows just really will climb. And this cow was tracked from July to August, which in southern New Mexico isn't cold. You can keep quite warm. So it is impressive what some can do. We just got to figure out ways to take advantage of that, and we're working on it. So what have we learned? We definitely know that terrain use is a heritable trait, and that there's real promise to select that in the future. We're hoping we can get it soon. Just as this colleague of ours said, he did a 40-year case study, and he thought it was his contention that couch potatoes actually begin to develop early in life as tater tots. Another exciting thing that may make this more feasible is the interest in progress with real-time tracking. We're doing a lot of work with real-time tracking. This is a tag, an earlier model of a tag made by Movement. It's a company out of Australia. Gives you cattle an hour, and it's not terribly expensive. Tag costs $60, should last 6 years, but it does take some equipment, antenna systems that probably out on rangeland cost about $2,000 to $2,500. So but it's expensive, but not terribly thing, and it's very like cheaper over time. Real-time tracking, this idea is it takes advantage of LoRa. So you have a GPS receiver on the tag, you have a LoRa antenna with a solar panel that where the data gets transferred. So the GPS position is transferred to a LoRa antenna. There is a cell phone router inside that transmits it to the via cell phone technology to the cloud, and that then cloud is transferred to your smartphone, and so you can start to get positions of your cows updated just about every hour, so you know where those cows are every hour. The downside is they don't quite work as well as hoped. We're trying to test out some other systems. All expensive and less, but it's still an exciting field. And if we do that, then there's become more and more things. We may be able to track more and more animals, have that data directly downloaded, solve the problem of getting them in and messing with it, and then be able to start developing phenotypes for producers. I'd be happy to take any questions. I really hope this is the beginning. This is the sunrise with the sunset. There's a lot of exciting things, especially with the new technologies, cheaper GPS, cheaper genetic tests. There's a lot of potential.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bailey. That's very interesting, and I think it has a lot of application for many people across the Western United States. So thank you for that. So a couple of questions have come in. One of them asked, have you compared docility traits and looked for a statistical interaction between that and cattle that are prone to hill climb?
We have. I just didn't have time to answer it. But we only had one thing, because all the cattle we've worked with are university cows, and I can tell you, producers, that university cows are not the same as real ranch cows because they get weighed all the time. And so they get used to it. They're easier to handle. But at having docility can really change. So when we were in Montana, we ranked the docility of every cow for 3 years and compared it to its terrain use. And surprisingly, cows that were extremely aggressive at calving, I mean, would eat your lunch, did not do any worse or any better. There was just no. Some cows that climbed were really aggressive, some weren't. So they look like they're different traits. And I was surprised. I thought that there would be a big relationship between docility and terrain use. And to my surprise, it didn't happen. Maybe different traits.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So another question that came in asked, how have you eliminated learning from the mother in all of this? And I guess, what's the heritability of this trait, and any cross-fostering studies? Do you know of any that have been done?
Sure. A colleague of mine at the University of Arizona, Larry Howery, did one in Idaho where he did a cross-fostering study. And there is no doubt that learning plays a role in terrain use. But the thing that we've done with DNA is that with DNA and genetic markers, there's no learning. That is just the genotype. It's just, we look at DNA. So we're, in that case, we're just looking at it. I'm not saying that there's no, and I definitely didn't. That's why I even talked about that experience study we did by moving cattle to East Texas and moving them back. Experience for sure plays a role. Experienced cattle have learn a lot, but it's difficult to improve that. Trying to train cattle to use terrain use is really time consuming. And so I'm looking for a cheap, easy way to improve distribution. And one of the ways is to do it through the bull. Now, we've asked producers, we didn't go to Idaho, but we went to California, we went to Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. And we asked people, would they be willing to pay more for a bull if they knew that it was, knew that we had some rating of it, of the potential breeding value for terrain use, and almost 80% of the people, ranchers, said it would. And those that didn't have any terrain. Those ones that did, it's because it's an important trait. It's really economical. And if we could do it, it's there. Of course, we always got to worry about, I mean, we're trying to select everything, right? But in the West, where there's terrain, it's a big deal, especially on public lands. And so I think if we can get this to work, I think it's there. And that's the only reason we're working on the genetic side, is because it's probably more practical than trying to train them. The other thing is, that's not completely true. If you do know cows that really climb, you get a double whammy. So if you have cows that really climb, that you know that, if you have tried, see them, keep their daughters, because you not only get the genetics, you get the training they have. So I am all for training every chance you get, but I'm just thinking in most cases it'd be easier to do with the bull.
Yep. Okay. And then you kind of alluded to it in that answer there, but I was thinking about that for sure. Looking at hill climbers and animals that utilize terrain differently, it's probably a trait that's maybe more valuable for producers in the West on public lands and things such as that. What would you say in regard to if we selected for that in cattle in the West and then moved those animals, or some of their offspring were in the East or where there's not much terrain? How would selection for terrain use in the West be manifested where there isn't much terrain? What kind of phenotype?
That's a cool question. We don't know the answer to that, but my guess is probably not much, because there just isn't a terrain. They're very likely they do still use the thing, but back east, just pastures are so small. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, like I tell my students, I mean, can a cow even in less than a section? I'm not sure. Back east, there's pastures that are really small. I mean, and it is an out west question, but I'm sure they'd still do fine. The good news is that so far, seen, at least phenotypically, is that like reproductive rates, body condition score, calf birth weights, weaning weights, pregnancy rates, there just wasn't any relationship, at least phenotypically. And we just, not yet, we don't quite have enough to do the genetic correlations, but we're interested. We're trying to try working on it. Once we get some more cows and more things, the problem is that cows cows with good pedigrees that like you'd get at a purebred operation often aren't grazing rough, steep, rugged terrain.
Right.
And that's been a problem for us. But with the advent of genetic testing, high density, other things, sequencing, we may be able to do some stuff. I think Dr. Garcia probably can talk about that. I'm hoping that you'd agree with me that those things are really going to help us down the road, especially on these hard to measure traits.
Yeah,
so
I think they will. I think that I think they're complex enough that we might be a little bit far away from it, but I think we're getting closer for sure.
Cool. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bailey. We appreciate your time here this afternoon and appreciate the information that you've shared. If anybody has questions for Dr. Bailey, you can put them in the chat, and if he's not able to see them or get them, we'll get them to them. And again, we just appreciate your time here this afternoon. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been fun. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So our next speaker